We are live.
Ok. Bună seara! Mă bucur că sunteți alături de noi în această seară, alături de noi și de editura Humanitas. Ne-am întâlnit să discutăm despre această carte, care a apărut recent la Humanitas. Ea se numește Conștiința dintr-o nouă perspectivă, scrisă de profesorul Michael Graziano. Eu sunt Alexandru Babeș și mă ocup și eu la rândul meu de neuroștiințe la Universitatea București și alături de mine în seara asta este colegul meu Dragoș Iliescu, profesor de Psihologie la Universitatea București. Dragoș, îți mulțumesc că ai acceptat invitația noastră.
Mulțumesc pentru invitație, sigur.
But most importantly, and now we are going to switch to English for the rest of the evening, we have with us Professor Michael Graziano himself, the author, live from New Jersey, I suppose. Hello, Michael. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, although I suppose in New Jersey it's about midday, right?
That's right, and thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
So to play the polite guest, I would like to ask Dragoș to kick off this discussion. So Dragoș, can you please shoot the first question for Michael?
Well, it's not going to be about the book yet. And I think that, you know, before getting to know the book, and we'll have a lot of occasions to talk about the book, what was most intriguing for me was the person and the character of Michael Graziano, which is very, very intriguing for me. You're a neuroscientist working with Princeton Universities. You're a novelist. You're a music composer, and I can see the instrument there behind you. And you're an avid practitioner of ventriloquism. So how do you fit so many things in just one life? And and who is Kevin?
That's the important question.
Give us a few thoughts about what makes you tick.
Right. Well, you know, I think lots of people have lots of hobbies, and I have lots of hobbies. And maybe one difference is that neuroscience and psychology are kind of in the category of hobbies for me. You know, everything's got to be something exciting and fun that satisfies your curiosity. And that's what I fill my life up with. And so whatever it is that's interesting to me, I'll glom onto it just because I want to know how it ticks. I want to look under the hood and see how it works. And music and music composition and writing fiction and psychology and neuroscience, these are things I've thought about for years and years since I was little, really, very young. But ventriloquism was a relatively late addition. And that came about when my son was born. When he was about 3, he wanted his stuffed animals to talk. And so I started making their little heads move around and started making them talk. And I can tell you there's a secret to learning ventriloquism, and that's to have a 3-year-old who insists that you do it every single day, many hours, and you practice it, and your mouth and your brain shape up, and you get good at it.
Okay, thank you. My turn now. So Michael, I would like to dive straight into the theory, into your theory of consciousness, your attention schema theory. So if my understanding is correct, consciousness is somehow produced when the brain turns onto itself, when the brain detects its own modus operandi, its own processing. But I was wondering if you could be a little bit more specific. So what exactly is an attention schema? You know, sometimes you refer to it as an internal model, as packets of information being processed in certain parts of the brain. So should we gather that the attention schema is an actual brain network or circuit? And if so, where it is located? Can you point it out for us?
Sure. Yes, you're right. There's this fundamental idea which is growing in the field of consciousness studies, this fundamental realization. And to start with that, the basic idea, at least as I would put it, is everything that you think you know about yourself, everything, no matter what it is, no matter how certain you are that it's real and it's present right now, everything you think you know derives from information in your brain, all of it. Otherwise, you can't think the thought or have the belief. So it's all information in the brain. And so when we talk about consciousness and subjective experience and these things that seem kind of non-physical and magical, the question to the scientist, the neuroscientist, is what's the packets of information in the brain that lead us to those self-descriptions? And where are those packets computed? What networks are involved in them? And what is the use, the adaptive use of those packets of information? That's the heart of the whole thing. And so now you ask this question, where is this attention schema, this packet of information that we think leads people to self-describe as having this consciousness stuff inside of them? Where is that packet of information? Well, there's a wonderful network of brain areas that's been studied, pretty thoroughly studied actually, called the theory of mind network, the social cognition network. And it's been studied because it revs up when people try to understand other people's consciousness. And what we're finding, so it's a social cognition, social understanding. And what we're finding is that it's the same network that lights up when you think about, talk about, or try to understand your own consciousness. And for example, one of the main nodes in that network is the so-called temporoparietal junction, the TPJ, and it's right about there, right above the ears, about an inch in and above the ears, right there. And there's other areas. There's another area in the front. There's a few areas on the midline. And they're hooked together in this brain spanning network. And it's been known for a while, like I said, it really is lights up in an MRI scanner. It lights up when people engage in trying to understand other people's conscious minds. And basically what we're finding is, yeah, this is the area that gives you your own concept of your own consciousness.
Do the famous or infamous mirror neurons play a role in this network?
So mirror neurons are, they're definitely important for understanding others. And I love mirror neurons. I used to, in an earlier life, a few decades ago, used to study movement control and the motor system in the brain. And that's where mirror neurons were actually first discovered. Because it turns out that if you see someone else grasp something with their hand, the motor neurons in your brain that normally control your own hand become active. Like you're rehearsing in this covert way how you would make the same action that you just saw someone else make. That's what a mirror neuron is. And so mirror neurons are all about understanding other people. But mirror neurons are not the same thing as building a model of someone else's conscious experience, right? It's about building models of other people's movements, and they're much more specific than that. So it's similar, it's akin to mirror neurons, the things I'm talking about, but it's actually not quite the same thing.
Thank you. Dragoș, your turn now.
Yeah, well, I would ask you about attention schema theory. It's not the only thing, you're very well known for many things. Yeah, but this is one of the things that you are very well known. It's attributed to you, that attention schema theory. So I would ask you, can you describe how you came to develop this theory? What kind of research and prior results does it rely on, the theory, and did you rely on when building it? And I'm specifically asking about this because you seem to have a very strong evolutionary stance. So consciousness is an aspect of attention that evolves over time through, I would add, natural selection. So does it give an evolutionary advantage, and what would that be? And can you?
Sure, yeah. So this theory, the attention schema theory, has many routes that you can follow to get to it. And I've described it in multiple different articles and so on from different directions. And I just gave a brief hint of it here, that you can get to it from social cognition, thinking about social context. But evolution is another perspective from which you can get to the same theory. So what good does this thing do? The brain, the main job of the brain is to control stuff. Like that's why we have a brain, so that we can move around and do things and control our own bodies and have some control over the outside world, and some control, ultimately, of the brain has control over its own self. So in a sense, the brain is all about control engineering. And there's a principle of control engineering that's very fundamental. Many people consider it the most fundamental principle of any control system. If you want to control something, this was first worked out in the case of robot arms. If you want to control an arm, the system doing the controlling needs a model or a simulation of the arm, a simplified kind of information chunk that keeps track of, well, what is an arm and what does it do? And if it's doing this, what will it do next? And what is my arm doing right now? So you need this little simulation of an arm to control your arm. And we all have that packed in our heads as this arm schema, as it's called, the arm schema. And we all know we do. And one way you can tell that it's there is if you look at people who are amputees and they're missing their arm, some of them still have the arm schema in their heads. And that's what a phantom limb is, this ghostly limb that the brain is constructing. That's a simulated limb, right? So that's if you want to control an arm. But what if you want to control internal processes to the brain? Like, what if the brain wants to shift its focus of attention from thing to thing? How does it control its own attention? Attention being its ability to focus its processing resources on a limited set of things and process them deeply. How does the brain move its own attention around? Well, it needs a model of it, just like for any other control problem. And so now we get into this really interesting part of the theory, this control engineering part of the theory. You need an attention schema, a simulation or model of your own attention to control your attention. Why do you need to control your attention? All complex behavior depends on it, all of it. Like, you can't get the jelly out of the fridge and the knife out of the drawer and spread it on the bread unless you can strategically control your attention and make it move from the knife to the jelly to the fridge. And so all our behavior depends on it. So from an evolutionary point of view, it's hugely important. You need that for any kind of complex or rich behavior.
Thank you.
Yeah, I liked the question about the evolutionary benefit of consciousness. This reminds me a bit of Groucho Marx, you know, when he said about future generations. He said, you know, I don't care much about future generations. What have they ever done for us? So the same question, you know, what has consciousness done for us? Because I think it comes with risks. You know, you can get lost in your own stream of consciousness, and then the saber-toothed cat can come and eat you up. So
yes,
it must provide clearly an evolutionary benefit of some sort, as you described. And also, it probably has to do with collaboration, with building social networks. I suppose being conscious helps with that.
Yes.
So actually, yeah. My question was also related to that, to this evolutionary standpoint. If you look at the evolutionary history of life on this planet, can you draw a line and say, you know, up until this point, there was no consciousness, no subjective experience, but from here on, we have consciousness. Is it possible to do that?
Well, not a line, because nothing ever works like that in evolution. It's always a fuzzy development. But I can say, if this theory is correct, that's a big if, right? We're still collecting data. We're still trying to understand the whole thing. But the theory itself makes a very strong, clear prediction that you need this specific kind of fairly rich cerebral cortex style attention. And you need a mechanism that controls it by using these self models. And that's what gives us our sense of experience, of subjective experience. And so now you can look through evolution and you can say, okay, invertebrates, not for the most part, no. You know, insects, no. Fish doesn't look like it, no. Surprisingly, many people would say, well, fish have very complex, intelligent behavior. Maybe they're conscious, but according to this theory, they have complex behavior, but they don't have this component. They don't have this kind of attention and control of attention. Amphibians, no, actually, not really. Reptiles, you're starting to get there. They have the beginnings of the brain structures and mechanisms that lead to our cerebral cortex. So mammals and birds are the main ones, mammals and birds.
I see. You know, we had a little political scandal in this country about a week ago, and one of the ministers called the prime minister a political zombie. I thought you'd like to know that. So the question is, why are we not all zombies? And probably when he called him a political zombie, he actually called him a fish. Then I understand from what you're saying, he downgraded him to a position of a fish.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, I think fish also have self-models. Like every creature that can move around has to have some information on itself and its relationship to the environment. Otherwise, it can't do that properly. It just doesn't have the same kinds of self-models that we have. And so if you could somehow tap into the info in a fish brain and extract it out, I don't think the fish is thinking I'm conscious, right? That it doesn't have that concept. You have to go to this, like I said, mostly mammalian and avian brain. However, there are some animals that might, so people point to octopuses. Octopuses are really interesting creatures. They're like the geniuses of the invertebrate world. And they belong on their own really weird evolutionary branch. And nobody really knows, but it is possible that octopuses have evolved similar kinds of mechanisms in their brains, but nobody's really studied that. So the point is, it's not so much a ladder of evolution where you can draw a cutoff line, but there are some species that have the kinds of mechanisms that fit into this theoretical structure that look like they would have what we call conscious experience.
Yeah, well, if it gives an evolutionary advantage, it probably was developed independently several times.
Sure.
Suggest with octopi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would follow up on that. You repeatedly say in your book and in other stances that you've taken publicly that most, I think you could say most other theories of consciousness rely at some level on magic, on magical thought. Yeah.
Yes.
Why? Can you explain that for the audience? How is your theory different from that?
Yeah. So yes, that's exactly right. There's basically two ways to try to understand consciousness, two kinds of theories. And one are what I call the magicalists. They would not call themselves that. And the other way, I'm not sure what to call the other way. The rationalists is what I like to call the other way. But of course, that kind of clearly states which side I consider myself on. But anyway, the magicalists works like this. There is an assumption that there is something in us that's essentially non-physical. And by non-physical, I mean the experience itself, the subjective experience. You can't push on it and measure a reaction force. You can't heat it up and measure its combustion temperature. You can't make these physical measurements on it. So it's not a physical thing. It's a sort of an adjunct somehow, and it floats inside of us, and it's this mysterious experience stuff. How does a brain produce it? Where does it come from? That's one way of thinking, and there appears to be no answer to that question. It's as soon as you assume there's magic present, and then you ask what produces it, I think you're stuck, right? And so these other theories posit things like, well, if you get a system that is complicated enough or integrates enough information, then the magic essence emerges. Or maybe when the information gets passed through a particular kind of a circuit, a network circuit, and it goes through this part of the brain and up to that part and back down again, and then the magic essence emerges from it, right? There are many, many theories like that that assume the magic exists. How does it get produced? And there is no answer to that. So you can't bridge the gap from physical mechanism to non-physical magic. Nobody can explain that gap. So those are magical theories. There's a totally different kind, and I kind of alluded to it already, which is that everything you think is true about yourself derives from information in your brain, everything. And therefore, the question facing us is, where is that information coming from? Why was the brain creating these self-narratives? And so I'll give you an example, somewhat extravagant example, but this is actually a true example. I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and he had a patient who was very spectacular. The patient was delusional and thought he had a squirrel in his head instead of a brain, and he was absolutely adamant about it. absolutely convinced of the squirrel in his head. Now, the therapist could say, well, okay, let's stop and think about that. Your brain has constructed information and built a description, a self-description. And in that description, there's a squirrel in your head. And that description is so automatized now that it's being generated all the time unconsciously, all the time under the surface. And your higher cognition has access to that description. And so you're convinced that you have it. So you can explain all that to him, right? And the guy will say, yeah, yada, yada, information, this and that. Your explanation stinks because you still have not explained how a squirrel got in my head. Okay. Now, just replace squirrel with the non-physical consciousness essence in my head. And that's the answer. The scientific question is, how and why and where is the brain constructing this information from which we derive conclusions about ourselves? That's answerable. And we have theories that are increasingly answering those questions. But if you assume the squirrel actually exists and you ask, how does the brain produce a squirrel? The answer is it's ill-posed. There's no answer to that.
I'm glad you brought up the patient because I wanted to ask you something from a clinical perspective.
Yeah.
So we know a lot about how the brain works from individual tragedies, from patients, unfortunate patients like famous Phineas Gage with the iron bar going through his frontal part of the brain, or from HM with his hippocampi being removed bilaterally by this reckless surgeon and so on. So, and you mentioned in your book, you mentioned hemispatial neglect as being associated with damage in and around the temporoparietal junction. So my question is this really a disease of consciousness, of subjective experience, or does it go deeper? Is it a deficit of attention?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It is both, right? So attention and consciousness are linked in this really tight way. They are hard to separate from each other, and they're kind of part of the same mechanism. And so in hemispatial neglect, typically it's caused by damage on the right side of the brain. And you lose all awareness and attention to the left side of space. And it's very spectacular in its most pure form. It's horrible, of course, but it's shocking the way people dress one side of the body and not the other and don't notice. And the way people draw a clock face and cram all the numbers in one side and don't realize what's going on. And they can't even conceive of the existence of the other side of space. It's erased from them. And it's quite interesting because stuff on that side, the neglected side, is processed in the brain, and sometimes processed at very high levels. And people can even react to it. And it affects how they speak, and it affects the decisions they make. They're just not aware of it. And so attention and awareness are both being severely affected by the damage to this side. And one of the most interesting aspects of it is the damages to an area that is also known to be involved in, like I said, social cognition, in understanding the minds of other people. And so again, we get this link between building a model of someone else's mind and building a model of your own mind. So understanding someone else's consciousness and kind of having a grasp, so to speak, on your own consciousness.
Right. Just one question related to what I asked before. What happens in split brain patients? Does the attention schema, does it fission like a bacteria? Do you get two consciousness within the same brain? Yeah. And which is me then? Is there a self which is aware? And this is the left side of the brain which can speak, and it has the feeling of a foreign consciousness being located at the same place. How does it work?
I think you have two consciousnesses. Yeah, the brain gets split. I mean, it depends on how complete the split is.
What happens with self-awareness?
Well, you have two yous inside the same head, and they're very similar because they have the same history, and they see the world from the same perspective, and they have to learn to get along with each other and coordinate all the time, like two really practiced dance partners. that just sort of know how to move with respect to each other. But yeah, there's two of you, that's it. And with clever experiments, as many people have shown, like Roger Sperry and Gazzaniga, Mike Gazzaniga, many people have shown if you do clever experiments, you can get the two sides of the brain answering questions in different ways, showing just how different they really are in their thinking and their knowledge.
That's cool. Dragoș.
It is cool. I would go one step further. Your proposition for science and for humanity actually is very clear and very unique. You say, consciousness is solvable. So you're not an agnostic about this. It is solvable, yeah? And in principle, it is buildable.
Yes.
This is what I get from your book and your books, actually, yeah? Now, how fast do you see this happening, and what do you think are the steps? I mean, if that would be your project, and you get funding, let's build it, let's solve it, and let's build it. What would be the steps be? Do you see it happening in 10 years, in 20, in your lifetime?
Yeah, well, as a mechanism that is useful for an intelligent agent in dealing with a complex world, I think this is something that is going to be built relatively soon. And so it's a little confusing, because often when people hear conscious machine, they're thinking of like C-3PO from the Star Wars movies, or HAL from the Space Odyssey movie. They're thinking of consciousness means something humanly intelligent and capable of conversation. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a mechanism, the same mechanism in us that gives us the subjective experience. So you can have a subjective experience, like your pet dog has subjective experiences, but it's not capable of conversation and super intelligent behavior, but it still has that mechanism in it. And it's a really important mechanism to help it guide its own attention around the world. And so I think building this kind of mechanism and giving it to artificial intelligence is going to come very soon. And the little bits of it are already there. People in artificial intelligence are picking up on this. I get emails all the time from people taking the basic principles of attention schema theory and applying them. And we're doing that too in the lab, applying them and finding, hey, this works really well. If you want an artificial machine that is attending to different parts of the world and you want it to do a really good job, give it this attention schema and it'll do 1,000 times better. So it's a really nice trick that artificial intelligence can use. I think building something of more human-like intelligence with this consciousness part added onto it, that's going to be much slower, but progress in artificial intelligence is blindingly fast, like ridiculously fast. And so it would not surprise me if we're looking decades, like 30, 40, 50 years from now, we have machines that people find very hard to distinguish from human level intelligence. That would not surprise me. Maybe that won't happen, I don't know, but given the rate at which things are moving, and especially the conceptual leaps being made, that would not surprise me too much. So this is something that's coming, and it's coming very, very rapidly.
Let me follow up on that with another question. Many of the big projects, big research projects for humanity were really mega scientific projects, like the Human Genome Project or CERN for, in Switzerland. Or do you think we have here, I mean, to solve consciousness is like solving the human genome. It's crazy, yeah? Do we need a mega scientific project for that, a CERN? Or can this be done by incremental additions of small pieces from everywhere in the world in different labs working on this? And what's your feeling of this?
Well, I think people have an inflated idea of the difficulty of solving consciousness, right? Solving the genome, here's the thing, Watson and Crick solved the genome, right? They found the essential answer. Then all the difficult work of the little details came, and that's what the Human Genome Project was, that required giant science to actually parse out all the little letters in the genetic code, and that's still ongoing, of course. So the essential idea of of consciousness, I think we have. I think people have glommed onto, not many people have contributed to this, right? But I think the essential concepts are there, right? So solving this thing, this is a kind of a computational trick or a data handling process that the brain uses. And the essence of it, the basic ideas are there, right? It's very popular for people, especially the magicalist people, to say, we don't know, it's a mystery, we'll never know. And I think people say that because they want to defend their mystery. And everyone's fond of that idea that maybe we'll never know, it's such a big mystery, oh my God. But no, I'm sorry, the essential concepts are there. The essential mechanism is understood at a very general level. But now how to implement it, what are the details? That's the hard part. And sure, I think that will involve huge science to really understand at the detailed level how these principles are implemented, or in the same vein, how to engineer them in artificial forms. So yeah, big science may have to do that.
It's very refreshing. You really are an optimist, and you even provide in your book a blueprint for how to build a conscious machine. So if anyone who's watching would like to have their own, just buy Michael's book, and then at the appendix you can find a recipe, right?
That's right.
But if I understand correctly, this machine would require first an internal model of what is it looking at. Let's say an apple, you were saying, and then it will have to have an internal model of itself, self-awareness in a way, with autobiographical details and input from sensors about the device's location and the dimensions and movement and such. And then in between, there has to be this attention schema, right, binding the two models. But then you say something which puzzled me. You say something that then you also need a cognitive search engine with the capability of accessing these models. So I didn't picture that. Is it like an extra layer? Where does it fit into your theory? And is there an equivalent in the human brain of this cognitive search engine?
So technically, you don't need this search engine in order to have your machine do its thing and be capable at whatever you want it to do. The usefulness of the search engine idea is if you want to talk to it and have it answer you, if you want to ask it, well, what's going on inside your head? Tell me. And then it gives you verbal answers. Well, you got to give it some verbal capability. You have to give it some module that can look at the other information in its brain, code that in linguistic form, and then talk about it. So that's just the convenient conversational module that you attach to it. Now, your dog or your cat doesn't have that, but I would say it's still conscious. It still has those other components. But if you want the machine to talk to you, you got to build this other thing. And all of this is, I think, currently buildable in simple form, very buildable in simple form.
So it's not like a homunculus which needs to receive information from the attention schema.
Not at all. No,
no,
it's just a verbal output, so to speak.
Dragoș.
Well, I think this is a more difficult question. At least it has always been difficult for me. So I look at it like this, understanding consciousness is important for science, and it is important for philosophy also. Yeah. So clearly there are people who thrive on it, and you and us, we seem to be in this category. But why should the average person care about this? Is it of practical utility? How does everyone's lives become better because of it?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, just from the point of philosophical insight, I think almost everyone is interested in this topic. It's sort of like astronomy, deep space astronomy. Everyone can ask the same question. Well, what good does it do me to understand what a distant galaxy is? And the answer is dark energy, yeah. Or dark energy, yeah. And the answer is, first and foremost, it's just really cool. And many people, most of the world recognizes the intrinsic coolness of it. In the case of consciousness, there is this second component to it, though, which is if we're right, and I think we are, this is not just some floaty add-on thing to our brains that's just there and makes us feel good. This is a crucial tool in the toolkit that makes the brain function correctly, that gives it the ability for extraordinary intelligence. This is part of the mechanism. So at the very heart of intelligence is the ability to take limited resources and focus them so that you can process something in great depth. And if you can't do that, then you become much dumber with the same amount of neural hardware, right? Because it's split up trying to do a trillion things at the same time. So the ability to focus your attention is the very heart of any kind of intelligence. And what we're saying is consciousness is one of the most important tools in controlling that attention. So it's pragmatically important for the brain, which means it's pragmatically important for information systems, for artificial intelligence. And that's where these theories will have their biggest impact on all of us, because this will transform our future, right? It's not just some floaty, gee whiz philosophical thing when artificial intelligence and computers start becoming very human-like, for good or bad. And or when we, another point that I raise in the book that you may or may not get to ask me about, when we start hundreds of years from now figuring out how to take the information in a person's brain and transfer it or upload it to a digital device, right? These are things that will affect our culture, our society. These are things that will affect all of us in very real, very pragmatic ways. So it's something everyone should care about, because it's, in my view, possibly the biggest revolution in our culture, in who we are.
Yeah, I was about to get to that, because I found that very disturbing, this part of your book, in a way, in a good way, because it forces you to think about that eventuality. Because again, you're saying it's inevitable that this will happen, that consciousness or the mind, its entirety, will be uploadable into some sort of informatic platform. And it's a bit scary, because you mentioned that your son, in a book, you mentioned that your son was passionate about dinosaurs, right? And I know I can relate to that. And I have fond memories from when my two sons were passionate about dinosaurs, because now it got worse. Now they are passionate about video games. So perhaps you know about Fortnite and such things?
I don't. I'm not super up on video games, but...
Because I can imagine us meeting in an afterlife in Fortnite or some such rubbish.
Yeah.
So it's a bit scary in a sense. But do you really believe this will happen? I mean, this is all based on this idea of connectomics and the progress which is being made in this. The idea that, well, we have 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections between these neurons. And then science will get to the point when all these tiny connections will be registered, will be understood in such a way that the content of the mind will be ready to be uplifted and put into a computer. But in my mind, this doesn't really work right, because this network is dynamic. It changes from minute to minute. Even two neurons which talk to each other, they can do it differently depending on the time of the day or depending on which other molecules are hanging around. So how can you capture this dynamic feature, this temporal dimension of the brain? Are you really so optimistic that this will happen?
I think it is inevitable that so-called mind uploading will happen. If we survive as a species long enough. It may take a while. I think it will depend on technology that has not been invented yet. There are some people who are much more optimistic and think this is a few decades in the future. That's, in my view, utterly impossible. We're nowhere near that yet. This could be a few centuries, but you never know how fast technology moves. I think this is inevitable. Now, you mentioned connectomics, and this is really key. The current way of thinking about mind uploading is indeed that the largest share of what a brain does is send information back and forth between neurons, across connections, the synapses between neurons. And so if you could reconstruct the network and all the connections between neurons, then you'd have the whole person's mind and brain. And that seems to be like a good first draft. but it's clearly not the whole answer. And you've pointed out some of those issues. There are, the neurons exist in a chemical bath. They're not just sending chemical signals to each other, but they live in a larger chemical bath that affects them. And in addition to neurons, there's other kinds of cells in the brain that play roles that are only beginning to be guessed at right now by science. So there's a lot more complexity in there that is not understood, that would probably be needed to properly upload a mind. But the point is, it's all information. It's all information in here. And information is something that in principle can be transferred from one platform to another. And so there's this sense where in principle, this is doable. And there's some ways, the roundworm, which has, the flatworm, I mean, which has about 300 neurons in its brain, its connectome is fully understood at this point. And in principle, with more work, maybe somebody could build a artificial uploaded flatworm crawling around in a video game world, right? That's where we are with its 300 neurons as opposed to our 86 billion neurons, right? So these little increments in progress in that direction. But people are so invested in it and working so hard in that direction that I don't see how this doesn't happen at some point.
Dragoș, would you like to be uploaded into a video game?
Yeah, well, I don't. Definitely, it's one of the paths to immortality. Not medical, but yeah, why not? If this is all that I can get, and I think that they actually, this is how they built that game, Snake. I think that was the flatworm crawling in, you know, Snake. Yeah, one of the older games. Yeah, I wouldn't mind. Probably you would get experimental subjects for that if you get so far along. You know, people who would volunteer to be uploaded.
I think so. Yeah,
I would. In old age, I probably would.
Your advice was to wait until version 1000 or so, not to be one of the pioneers.
Yeah, don't be an early adopter. Yeah, because the thing is, and just to point out, if you take a real brain that's like wired up correctly and you do the tiniest little thing to it, like a little chemical imbalance or a concussion that disturbs some of the connectivity, the effects can be devastating, right? And that person can suffer enormously. So now imagine trying to copy all that and upload it artificially and you don't get it quite right. And it's like 99.99% right, but it's got that last little bit that's not right. That would be a very unhappy uploaded consciousness. So that's why I say don't be an early adopter on that one, whenever it happens.
Yep.
We have some questions from our viewers. So Dragoș, would you like to ask anything else, or shall we parse through these questions that we received?
The viewers, and I still have some questions if we get some time in the end.
Sure.
Okay, let's look at a couple of the questions that we received. So we have a question. Is it possible to understand animal cognition too from your approach?
So animal cognition is a really wonderful, really interesting area of research, and lots of people are studying animal cognition. Animal consciousness is very hard to study. Some people try, but you can't ask them, what are you experiencing? So experimentally, it's hard to do. If this theory is correct, the more data we collect on it in humans, the more we come to understand it, then it becomes more applicable to other kinds of brains. And like I said, the best guess I can give is the kinds of mechanisms that give us consciousness are in operation probably in every mammal, probably in every bird, when you just look at the brains and how these animals function. So you can, to some degree, extend this to other animals. It's just hard to study.
Another question we have here is consciousness under evolutionary pressure, as it is a new trait? What could possibly be next?
That's a really interesting question. Certainly it has been under evolutionary pressure. That's how it got to be where it is. I don't know if I can guess what's next, other than you know, the technological side is next. We invent a new form of order in the universe that's not life, but it's non-living things that are more intelligent, potentially trillions of times more intelligent than any living thing ever was. So in a sense, that's like the next step in this evolutionary process. But in terms of Darwinian biological evolution, I don't know. That's a really good question. I'll just say I don't know the answer to that one.
Is there a direct link between consciousness and instincts?
I think in a sense they're really separate from each other. So instincts are these deeply built-in, wired-in processes, responses that people have, emotional or behavioral responses to specific circumstances. So that's kind of the psychological definition of an instinct. I suppose in a sense there's a relationship there, because consciousness, what we're saying, is in effect an automatic process that we can't help, that the brain is constructing constantly. So it's different, but perhaps there's some relationship there.
I thought of a question. So to do my homework for this discussion, I browsed through other books about consciousness. So quite a few of them came out in recent years. There's one from Christoph Koch. There's one from Stanislas Dehaene. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Is it Dehaene? Or
yeah.
Dehaene. So there are competing theories. How does your idea of the attention schema relate to, say, the global workspace theory or the integrated information theory?
Right. So as we said a little bit ago, many of these theories are what I call magicalist theories. And so the integrated information theory is a good example of what I would call magicalist. Integrate information together enough according to some mathematical formula. And
the phi number.
Right, phi, the number phi. And then the experience-ness emerges. And it has lots of theoretical problems, like everything in the universe has some information integrated within it, everything. And so
they go to panpsychism. They go
yes, exactly.
The stone having consciousness, right?
Right. And then when everything has consciousness, it doesn't mean anything anymore, and it's not clear what their theory means. So it's really quite problematical when you take the magic and you try to push it and as far as you can and combine it with an attempt at logic, and the thing collapses. In my view, I am not a fan of that theory. And I think many people in neuroscience and psychology also recognize the weaknesses there. The global workspace theory is really interesting to me. It basically says when information in the brain is collected and enhanced, so you're attending to it, so the information is enhanced, and it reaches kind of a central place where it can influence other systems around the brain. It can influence your decisions about what to do or what to say or what to remember. That's the condition in which you typically become conscious of that stuff. And that's the global workspace, right? And that idea has been embedded in a kind of neuroscience framework. And so the global workspace theory is more a description rather than an explanation. It says, these are the conditions in which whatever causes consciousness happens. And that theory, I think, is really compatible with what we're talking about. In fact, you can take the two and just glom them together, and you get some really interesting results. And I think this is true.
It just needs the attention schema to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think in some ways of the attention schema as being like the spark plug in the engine. All these different theories are describing different parts of the engine. Well, you take the spark plug and stick it in there and the whole thing's going to work. So many of these theories have a place. Many of these theories contribute something, but it's really useful to stop thinking of them as rivals and try to understand how they actually might complement each other.
Dragoș?
Yeah, well, I have a more complicated question. I think you describe in some, not in this book, but in other things that you've done and said, you describe our current conception of conscious as very egocentric, I think. So you compare it in some way to how society thought about our position in the solar system previous of Copernicus, and about the origin of humans before Darwin. And so obviously these theories and others have knocked us a little, piece by piece off from the pedestal that we've put ourselves on. And so yeah. Do you think that rethinking consciousness could have similar ramifications? Because ramifications could be socially very deep. Ethical repercussions could be following on this new understanding. After all, I think that we define in some ways humanity based on consciousness. So would you care to comment on that?
Sure. I think it will have giant consequences. I think in a sense it already is, because for at least 100 years, neuroscience has basically grasped that the mind is a function of a kind of big biological machine in there, and that other animals have similar, if smaller, versions of the same machine. And that basic concept has already changed a lot of how we think about other animals and about ourselves and about ethics, and so it's enormously consequential. But I think you're right. I've often thought that there are three huge philosophical scientific questions. And one is, what is our relationship to the universe? And, Copernicus basically answered that. We're not at the center. The universe is a bunch of stuff and we're one of the many specks. Like, that's the answer. And that gets elaborated, and now we know about other galaxies and this and that, but the essential answer is still there. And the second major question is, what is our relation to the rest of life? And in a sense, Darwin answered that. We're all part of a big tree of relatedness, related by natural selection. And we're one branch on that tree. We're like many other branches and twigs. We're just another branch on that biological twig, and we're all part of the same big world of life. And that's the answer to that one, which also obviously had huge consequences socially. And the third huge scientific philosophical question is, what is our relationship to essentially the spirit world? What is the spirit world? What is consciousness? Because, a spirit is consciousness. So what is consciousness? And where does it come from? And what does it mean to be conscious? And what is and what isn't conscious? And the answer to that one, I think, is emerging right now. We have this answer that it's information. It's information being processed in specific ways in this big biological machine. That's what consciousness is. That's what mind is. And that will have, it already has huge consequences, and will have even bigger transformative consequences when we get to the point when that information is transferable, copyable from device to device, because that really opens up everything. It fundamentally alters who and what we are.
We had another question just came through. Speaking of recent developments, psychedelics are making a comeback in scientific research. Care to share your perspective on how such substances can further our understanding of consciousness?
I think that a lot of the work on psychedelics and consciousness is kind of a second type of question. So one basic type of question is, how can I have a subjective experience of anything at all? Like our desktop computer handles information, but doesn't appear to have any subjective experience. I handle information in my brain. I have subjective experience. Where does that subjective experience come from? That's the most fundamental question that I'm working on, that many people around the world are working on. There's a second question, which is, given that you have subjective experiences, what is the range of different kinds of experiences you can have? And that's where things like psychedelics or meditation or other kinds of mind-altered states come in, where you ask, well, just how far can you stretch the kinds of experiences you have? And that's kind of a second question. Yeah, it's a very interesting one as well. So yeah, I think there is an increasing popularity in studying these altered states. For myself, I'm actually very interested in meditative states and how those relate to brain networks.
So it's like the distinction between the bucket and the content of the bucket.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I'm very at the root, at the most fundamental. I'm interested in the bucket of consciousness. How do we have a bucket that things go into? And the second question is, what are the things that you can put into the bucket of consciousness?
Another question, how do you envision laws and regulations in society when transferring consciousness will be possible and will be a common practice?
I envision it being moral chaos. I think everyone's going to have a hard time with it, and it's going to be a disaster, at least at first. That's what I think is going to happen. I can't see any other way around it. But what do I know? This is a long time in our future. Like I said, possibly hundreds of years. But if you have a limited...
Like making many copies of yourself, for example. Yeah. Like, do you know Richard Morgan, Altered Carbon? You know this book?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
With the stacks that they put in the next.
Right. So fiction has just begun to grapple with this problem. But at some point, it's going to be real. And not only that, if you have a limited resources, like there's the digital afterlife, but only so many people can get in there because there's only so much data it can handle. Who gets in there? Like, who decides that? And what do you have to do in this life to get the perk of going in there? And how coercive is that? You know, if somebody says, well, in our current world, one of the main ways people get coerced is when a religious leader says, if you do this, that, and that, then you'll go to the afterlife. And that's an afterlife that is not objectively demonstratable. That's, something you can't point to and say, there it actually is, right? People have to take your word for it. But what happens when the afterlife is something objectively demonstratable, where you can tell someone, here, have a Skype conversation or a Zoom conversation with somebody in it and find out what it's like, and you know it's real. Now I'll let you in there if you do this, that, and that for me, right? It becomes very coercive. So the moral dilemmas are huge, let's just say.
I was wondering if there's any clinical application of your theory. I'm thinking about patient in vegetative states, or particularly this lock-in patients. This is fascinating. And question being, would it be possible to check whether they have an intact attention schema by measuring some sort of processing in the brain with magneto or electrical activities or EEGs or MRIs or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Because that's an area of great interest clinically. There are people who clinically appear to lack consciousness. And some of them do, and some of them may not, but just can't communicate. It's not so clear. And so how do you handle that? And the data is, well, it's a very, very rich, very interesting field. I think the data is showing that the same networks that we think are involved in computing this stuff we're talking about, these attention schemas and these models of minds, the same brain networks are the ones that, when damaged, when you can show that they're degraded and damaged, you look at them in an MRI and there's big holes in the brain in those locations. Those are the people who appear to be without consciousness and appear not to be able to recover in any way. Right? And people who have those networks in some form still intact appear to be people who still have this consciousness thing. And so, yes, this kind of theory can contribute to that area of research. In some way, it can contribute to understanding, what do you need? What's the network you need? What's really in there that gives you this consciousness thing?
Dragoș? Anything else? Any question?
Be accused? No.
You ran out of questions?
Uh-oh.
Well, I think we should wrap it up. I think we've used enough of your time, Michael. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I would like to give you the final word to address our Romanian readers. Maybe you have something to tell them that we missed in this discussion, something that would make them interested in reading your book.
Well, I mean, I hope that you enjoy the book. It's an attempt to understand one of the great mysteries of our time. And like I said, science is really beginning to get to the heart of this kind of mystery. And the answers are surprising. And the answers have these profound consequences. And so in a sense, this is why I've organized the book as an evolutionary story, starting from the very beginning of life, stepping through as this consciousness thing evolves, and then continuing on into possible futures of where we take it and what we do with it technologically. And like I say, the watershed moment in our history as a species is the moment we understand consciousness well enough to engineer it, to build it, and to use that technology.
Okay, nice final words. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Dragoș.
Thank you.
Și vă mulțumim și dumneavoastră celor care ați fost alături de noi. Sper să ne mai revedem și cu ocazia altor lansări din colecția de știință a editurii Humanitas. La revedere!